Welcome to my video. Subscribe now. Airline. It was a flying fashion show, a statement of style, a revolution wrapped in aluminum and jet fuel. Captain Robert Mitchell had been flying for Braniff for 12 years. He remembered the old days, when flight attendants wore simple uniforms and planes were painted in modest colors. But those days were gone. Alexander Calder had painted their jets in wild, artistic schemes. Emilio Pucci had designed uniforms that belonged on a Milan runway, not in an aircraft cabin. The company's president, Harding Lawrence, had a vision that was both brilliant and terrifying: make flying an experience so unique that people would choose Braniff over any competitor. Robert sat in the cockpit of Flight 327, bound from Dallas to Miami. Beside him, First Officer Daniel Walsh was running through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. Daniel was younger, newer to the company, and still somewhat dazzled by the airline's theatrical approach to aviation. "Did you see the new commercial?" Daniel asked, glancing at Robert with an amused smile. "The one where they say, 'When you got it, flaunt it'?" Robert nodded slowly. He had seen it. He had seen all of them. The company was spending millions on advertising, hiring famous artists and designers, pushing boundaries that other airlines wouldn't dare approach. It was exciting. It was innovative. It was also becoming increasingly complicated. "I heard they're introducing a new service protocol next month," Daniel continued, adjusting his headset. "Something about enhanced passenger interaction. Making every flight feel like a party." Robert felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He loved flying. He had always loved flying. But lately, the job had become less about aviation and more about performance. The company wanted pilots to make announcements that sounded like radio shows. They wanted flight attendants to change uniforms mid-flight, transforming from one Pucci design to another like butterflies emerging from cocoons. They wanted every flight to be memorable, extraordinary, unforgettable. But Robert just wanted to fly safely. The passengers began boarding. Robert could hear them through the cockpit door, their voices rising in excitement as they entered the aircraft. The interior of the plane was decorated in vibrant oranges and browns, with patterns that seemed to dance across the walls. Everything about Braniff was designed to overwhelm the senses, to make passengers feel like they had stepped into another world. "Flight 327, you are cleared for pushback," came the voice of ground control through Robert's headset. "Roger that," Robert replied, his voice calm and steady. This was the part he loved. The technical precision, the communication with the tower, the systematic process of preparing a massive machine for flight. This was pure aviation, uncomplicated by marketing strategies and corporate visions. The flight to Miami was scheduled to take 3 hours and 40 minutes. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Robert settled into the rhythm of the flight. The sky was clear, the weather was perfect, and the aircraft was performing beautifully. For a moment, everything felt right. Then the intercom buzzed. It was Linda Harrison, the lead flight attendant. "Captain Mitchell, we have a situation," her voice came through, tight with stress. Robert's hand instinctively moved to the intercom button. "What kind of situation, Linda?" "The new service protocol. Corporate sent a memo yesterday. We're supposed to implement it starting today. But there's been a misunderstanding." Robert closed his eyes briefly. He had not received any memo. He had not been briefed on any new protocol. This was happening more and more frequently. The company was moving so fast, implementing changes so rapidly, that communication was breaking down. Pilots were learning about new procedures from flight attendants. Ground crews were receiving contradictory instructions. The entire operation was becoming chaotic. "What does the protocol say?" Robert asked. Linda's voice wavered slightly. "It says we're supposed to serve a full gourmet meal, but the catering company loaded the wrong food. We have twice the amount of entrees and no desserts. And half the passengers pre-ordered vegetarian meals that we don't have. And the memo says we're supposed to serve everything on the new designer china, but half the plates are still packed in boxes in the galley because no one showed us how to unpack them safely during flight." Daniel was listening intently, his eyes widening with each new detail. Robert felt the situation unfolding like a slow-motion disaster. This was not a mechanical failure. This was not weather. This was something far more difficult to manage: corporate ambition colliding with operational reality. "And there's more," Linda continued. "The memo says we're supposed to do a mid-flight fashion show. The attendants are supposed to change uniforms 3 times during the flight and walk down the aisles modeling each outfit. But we only have 2 lavatories working, and there are 6 of us trying to coordinate changes. It's impossible. Robert took a deep breath. He had joined Braniff because he believed in the company's spirit of innovation. He had admired Harding Lawrence's courage to try something different, to challenge the boring conventions of air travel. But somewhere along the way, the vision had become confused. The instructions had multiplied and contradicted each other. The desire to be extraordinary had created extraordinary problems. Linda, Robert said quietly, forget the memo. There was silence on the other end of the intercom. Sir, Linda finally replied, uncertainty in her voice. Serve whatever food you have. Use whatever plates are accessible. Skip the fashion show. Focus on making the passengers comfortable and safe. That's the real job. Robert could almost hear Linda's relief through the speaker. Are you sure, Captain? The memo came from corporate headquarters. It was marked as mandatory. I'm sure, Robert said firmly. I'll take responsibility. Just do what makes sense. As the flight continued, Robert found himself thinking about what had gone wrong. Braniff International Airways had started with a beautiful idea, make flying special again. In an era when air travel was becoming routine and boring, they had tried to inject glamour and excitement. They had hired the best designers, the most creative minds, the most talented artists. They had pushed boundaries and taken risks. But they had forgotten the most important thing. They had forgotten that an airline's primary job was not to dazzle or impress. It was to transport people safely from one place to another. Everything else was secondary. All the fashion shows and artistic paint schemes and designer uniforms were meaningless if the basic operation was falling apart. The company had given too many instructions. Each department had added its own requirements, its own protocols, its own vision of what Braniff should be. No one had stopped to ask whether all these instructions could actually be followed simultaneously. No one had checked whether the pilots and flight attendants and ground crews could actually implement all these brilliant ideas in the real world, with real constraints and real challenges. The instructions had gone horribly wrong because there had been too many of them, all at once, without coordination or consideration for the people who had to execute them. Daniel was watching Robert, carefully. Do you think we'll get in trouble? He asked. Robert smiled slightly. Probably. But sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences. The flight landed in Miami smoothly, exactly on schedule. The passengers deplaned, and most of them seemed happy despite the confused meal service and the absence of a fashion show. They had arrived safely, which was what truly mattered. 3 days later, Robert received a summons to corporate headquarters in Dallas. He expected a reprimand, possibly a suspension. He had directly contradicted a mandatory protocol. He had undermined the company's carefully crafted brand experience. He walked into the executive conference room with his head held high. Harding Lawrence sat at the head of the table, surrounded by several vice presidents. The room was decorated in the same vibrant style as the aircraft, all bold colors and artistic statements. Captain Mitchell, Harding Lawrence said, gesturing to an empty chair. Sit down, please. Robert sat. He waited. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Finally, Lawrence spoke again. I've been reviewing reports from your flight. I've also been reviewing reports from dozens of other flights over the past 3 months. Do you know what I've discovered? Robert remained silent. I've discovered that we've become so obsessed with being different that we've forgotten how to be good. We've given our people so many instructions, so many requirements, so many protocols that they can barely do their jobs. We've turned flying into a circus, and circuses eventually collapse. Lawrence stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the Dallas skyline. I built this company on the idea that flying should be exciting. I still believe that, but excitement without competence is just chaos. He turned back to face Robert. You made a decision on your flight to ignore a mandatory protocol. You prioritized passenger safety and comfort over corporate branding. You did what made sense in the moment, rather than what you were told to do. And you know what? You were absolutely right. Robert felt surprise wash over him. This was not the conversation he had expected. We're going to make changes, Lawrence continued. We're going to simplify our operations. We're going to reduce the number of protocols and give our crews more autonomy to make decisions. We're going to remember that we're an airline first and a fashion statement second. And I want you to help us do it. Over the following months, Braniff International Airways began a quiet transformation. They kept the artistic paint schemes and the designer uniforms, but they eliminated the impossible service requirements. They reduced the number of mid-flight costume changes. They stopped trying to serve gourmet meals on flights too short to properly prepare them. They gave pilots and flight attendants the authority to adapt procedures to real-world conditions. The changes were not dramatic or newsworthy. There were no press conferences announcing a new direction. But slowly, steadily, the company became more functional. Employees felt less stressed. Passengers experienced fewer service failures. The operation ran more smoothly. Robert continued flying for Braniff for many more years. He watched the airline industry evolve, watched companies rise and fall, watched the golden age of aviation gradually fade into history. Braniff itself would eventually face financial difficulties and cease operations in the 1980s. But that was still years away. On quiet nights, flying across dark skies with stars scattered above and cities glowing below, Robert would think about that flight to Miami and the lesson it had taught him. Instructions were important. Procedures were necessary. But the people executing those instructions needed the wisdom to know when to follow them exactly and when to adapt them to reality. The best organizations were not the ones with the most rules or the most detailed procedures. They were the ones that trusted their people to think, to judge, to make intelligent decisions in complex situations. They were the ones that valued competence over compliance, wisdom over rigid adherence to protocol. As Robert guided his aircraft through the darkness, he felt grateful for the opportunity to do work that mattered. Flying was not just about following instructions. It was about understanding the principles behind those instructions and applying them intelligently. It was about balancing competing demands and making difficult choices. It was about keeping people safe while still striving for excellence. The sky was vast and forgiving. The stars shone steadily above. And below, countless people were living their lives, pursuing their dreams, making their own difficult choices in their own complex situations. Robert smiled to himself and adjusted his course slightly, heading home through the beautiful, dangerous, infinitely complicated sky.